Okay, so, when you're dealing with data these days, it can sometimes feel like, well,
Overwhelming.
yeah, a little overwhelming, right? Like
Absolutely.
you're trying to solve this huge puzzle with like a million rules that you got to keep in mind, and it's just a lot.
Yeah, for sure.
That's why I think we're diving straight into an area that's super important today, understanding the actual legislation that governs how we use data safely.
Yeah, definitely. How we can use data and should use data.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we're looking at this through the lens of something that's often referred to as the K1 definition or the K1 knowledge area. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
So for you listening, the information you've shared with us really focuses specifically on the UK.
right. And that's key because we'll be zeroing in on two, I guess you could say, fundamental pieces of data protection law in the UK,
Data Foundation.
the UK GDPR, and then the Data Protection Act of 2018.
Yeah.
Okay, so our goal today is to really dig into these laws and pull out the most important information, for anyone working with data.
Right? Like boots on the ground. What does this mean for me?
Yeah, to cut through the legal jargon and like really get to what you need to know to like be on top of your game.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
And just a little bit of background.
Yeah.
We're going to be exploring, as we mentioned, the UK GDPR and then also the Data Protection Act 2018.
Right.
You can kind of think of these as the essential rule book, really, for handling data responsibly in the UK.
Yeah, the guidelines.
And I think we've uncovered some really interesting connections and practical insights for our listeners, too.
Yeah. Hopefully some aha moments.
Yeah, definitely some light bulb moments. That should be really helpful.
Yeah, and I think it's really about moving beyond just knowing that these laws exist
Right.
to actually understanding how they impact you in your day-to-day.
Exactly. So let's jump right in. We've already mentioned this like K1 thing, this K1 definition.
Yeah.
So what does that actually mean when we talk about it in a professional context?
Yeah, so in professional standards, K1 really points to demonstrating your understanding of the relevant data protection laws and how they should be applied to keep data safe.
Okay.
So it's really about showing that you have the knowledge, you
Right.
know how to use it, and then also you understand the impact of actually applying those laws correctly.
Okay. Got it.
So it's not enough to just know the text. You
Yeah.
really need to show you understand how it works in practice.
So it's not about like reciting legal terms. It's really about showing that you actually know what you're talking about and can apply it.
Precisely.
Okay.
So to really show that understanding, to really nail K1, it comes down to being able to demonstrate those three things: the core knowledge, the application, and then the impact of that application.
Got it. So where do we even begin to look at, the actual legislation?
Well, the real foundation for data protection in the UK is without a doubt the UK GDPR.
Yeah.
And as we mentioned, this is essentially the EU GDPR that was adapted for the UK after Brexit.
Okay, so what are the absolute, like, must-know core principles of the GDPR for anyone who's working with data?
Yeah. So think of these as the guiding stars, the key pillars that you really want to think about.
Yeah.
And these include things like lawfulness,
Yeah.
fairness, and transparency.
Yeah.
And these mean that any data processing that you're doing needs to have a valid legal basis,
Right.
needs to be conducted in an honest way,
Yeah.
and people need to be aware of how their data is being used.
Mm.
Then you've got things like data minimization, which is all about only collecting the data that you need
Yeah.
for your specific purpose.
Yeah.
You don't want to be, taking more than you need.
Right.
Accuracy is another really critical one,
Yeah.
making sure that the data is correct and it's being kept up to date.
Yeah.
And then finally, you've got integrity and confidentiality, which is often talked about together as security.
Okay.
And that requires that personal data is protected against, unauthorized access, use, loss, or damage.
Okay, that's a really clear overview. Can you give us like a concrete example of how these principles might play out in the real world for someone who's actually working with data?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So imagine that you're a data analyst and you're putting together maybe some reports for different teams.
Okay. Yeah.
So data minimization would really be your guide to only include the specific data points that those teams need to draw their conclusions.
Right.
It's not about throwing in everything you have.
Yeah.
And then similarly, when it comes to integrity and confidentiality, you might use anonymization or pseudonymization techniques on the data where possible before sharing it.
Okay.
And this helps prevent individuals from being identified, which enhances security of that data
Yeah.
and ticks those GDPR boxes.
Okay, so it's about actively thinking about these principles when you're handling data.
Exactly. And in another practical area is data retention.
Okay.
And this directly links to the principle of storage limitation. So the UK GDPR clearly states that personal data should only be kept for as long as it's necessary for the reasons it was collected.
Right.
So as a data analyst, you need to know and follow your organization's policies on how long different types of data should be kept for.
Yeah.
For example, let's say you're working on a customer segmentation project.
Okay.
The data sets that you use should have clear access controls,
Yeah.
be stored securely, and crucially, have a defined time frame for how long they'll be kept in line with GDPR.
Okay.
And once that time's up, that data should be deleted.
Okay, so the UK GDPR gives us this broad framework, but then we also have this Data Protection Act of 2018.
Yeah.
So how does that piece of the puzzle fit in?
Yeah, well, think of it this way. The Data Protection Act 2018 really works alongside the UK GDPR.
Great.
It fills in the specific details for the UK.
Right.
So the UK GDPR gives us those core principles,
Yeah.
the rights of individuals,
Yeah.
and general responsibilities for those who control and process data. The Data Protection Act then provides those UK-specific elements.
Right.
So it clarifies certain parts of the GDPR,
Oh, yeah.
and importantly, it sets out exemptions and rules for enforcement that are really specific to the UK legal system.
So the GDPR kind of gives us the what in data protection.
Yeah, it sets the scene.
And then the Data Protection Act kind of gives us the how within the UK.
Precisely.
Okay.
So yeah, the GDPR kind of sets the overall direction, and the Data Protection Act provides that more detailed roadmap for navigating data protection within the UK.
Right. So it's not just one or the other. You need to know about both.
Absolutely.
Okay. So can you give us like an example of how these two laws might work together in a real world scenario for someone in a data-focused role?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
So let's take the example of a company running a staff survey
Right.
where they collect personal information.
Okay.
Now, the way they handle that data initially, making sure it's fair,
Yeah.
it's used for a specific purpose, and that's communicated clearly. That's all governed by the UK GDPR.
Right.
Now, when the company wants to share those findings with, say, the HR department or senior management,
Yeah.
both laws come into play.
Okay.
So the need to anonymize the survey responses, to protect the identities of staff,
Right.
ensuring only aggregated and non-identifiable insights are shared, that comes from principles in both the UK GDPR and the Data Protection Act.
Okay.
Additionally, the Data Protection Act might offer more specific guidance if the survey happens to collect particularly sensitive types of data.
Okay. So thinking specifically about someone in a like data analyst role, how can their understanding of these laws like really help contribute to a safer, more secure data environment?
Yeah, I mean, a data analyst is really on the front lines here. By having that solid grasp of these laws, they're in a really good position to spot potential risks.
Okay.
For example, they might notice a shared network folder containing spreadsheets full of customer data
Yeah.
that's accessible to way more people than necessary.
Yeah.
Now, this would be a clear breach of the integrity and confidentiality principles under the GDPR,
Yeah.
and it could also violate the security requirements of the Data Protection Act.
Okay.
So by flagging these risks and working with their IT and compliance teams to strengthen security measures
Right.
and improve staff training on how to handle data,
Yeah.
they're making a direct contribution to a safer environment.
So it's about taking that knowledge and actually using it proactively, not just, reading it and forgetting about it.
Absolutely.
Okay. And how else?
It also involves things like actively participating in cybersecurity and data protection training.
Right.
That's offered by an organization
Yeah.
that can really help build a stronger culture of awareness
Okay.
and responsibility across the board.
Right.
This understanding then influences how a data analyst designs their processes, the type of data they collect, and how they share their findings.
Okay. So we talked about privacy by design earlier.
Yeah.
Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, privacy by design is really about encouraging organizations to think about data protection and privacy right from the very start of a project or a system or a process that involves personal data. So for someone in a data analyst role, this might mean considering the data privacy implications when they're asked to start using a new analytics tool,
Right.
or they're planning to combine data from different sources
Okay.
by proactively thinking about things like data minimization,
Yeah.
implementing those security safeguards,
Yeah.
and ensuring transparency right from the outset. They can build privacy into the foundation of the project rather than trying to fix it as an afterthought.
That sounds a lot easier.
Yeah, it's a much more effective and robust approach.
So what are some of the more nuanced aspects or roles that someone should be aware of to really demonstrate a strong understanding in this area? You mentioned the DPO, ISO 27001, and SECIOs earlier.
Yeah, so these are elements that show a more comprehensive grasp of the data protection landscape. So firstly, the role of the Data Protection Officer, or DPO,
Yeah.
under the UK GDPR, certain types of organizations, particularly those that process large-scale, special categories of data or engage in systematic monitoring of individuals, are required to appoint a DPO.
Yeah.
Now, this person, the DPO, has really specific responsibilities, which include monitoring the organization's compliance with data protection laws,
Oh, no.
providing advice on conducting DPIAs or data protection impact assessments,
Okay.
and acting as the main point of contact for individuals whose data is being processed, as well as the ICO, which is the Information Commissioner's Office.
Right, right.
So understanding what a DPO does
Yeah.
and considering how your work as a data analyst might interact with them
Right.
indicates a more sophisticated understanding.
So it's not just about knowing the laws, it's also about understanding the rules within an organization.
Exactly.
Okay, what about ISO 27001 and SECIOs?
Right. So ISO IEC 27001 is a leading international standard for information security management systems. Now, while it's not a legal requirement in the same way that GDPR is achieving,
Right.
and maintaining that ISO 27001 certification shows that an organization is following best practices for managing and protecting all their information assets.
Okay.
And that includes personal data.
Right.
So it covers areas like ensuring data confidentiality,
Okay.
maintaining its integrity,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
guaranteeing its availability.
Yeah.
So for a data analyst, being aware of whether their organization adheres to those standards
Yeah.
and understanding how their tasks contribute to these broader ISO-aligned security policies
Right.
shows a deeper level of understanding of data protection.
Right. And you mentioned SECIOs. What are
Yes.
those again?
So SKOs, or Standard Control Objectives, are essentially internal data frameworks or similar sets of guidelines that organizations put in place to help manage risk and ensure data governance.
Right.
They might be based on well-known frameworks,
Okay.
or they could be specific to the organization's needs and structure. So as a data analyst, understanding how your work fits within these SEOs
Right.
and being able to identify and flag any potential discrepancies
Okay.
shows a proactive and responsible approach to data governance
Right.
that goes beyond just meeting the basic legal requirements.
So it's about moving beyond just ticking boxes and actually embedding this mindset into your daily activities.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's really about cultivating a way of thinking where data protection isn't an afterthought,
Yeah.
but a fundamental consideration in all data-related work that you do.
Okay, well, this has been super helpful. I feel like we've really dug deep into these crucial pieces of legislation.
Absolutely. I hope you listening now have a much clearer picture of the UK GDPR
Yeah.
and the Data Protection Act, and more importantly, how they impact your professional role when you're working with data.
So the real message here is that handling data safely and responsibly isn't just about knowing the rules, it's about applying them.
Precisely. And it calls for a thoughtful and proactive approach
Yeah.
where you're considering those principles. Yeah.
And requirements of both the UK GDPR and the Data Protection Act every day in your tasks.
And on that note, here's a final thought for you to consider. Given that data is such a huge part of almost everything these days,
Yeah, it really is.
how might understanding and really championing these data protection principles
Yeah.
not only ensure that you're legally compliant,
Right.
and also help you build trust with people you work with,
Absolutely.
and ultimately lead to better innovation?
Yeah.
It's about looking beyond the immediate legal obligations and thinking about the bigger impact of data ethics and security for everyone.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. And on that note, that's our show for today.
Thanks for listening.